Hi everybody, my name is Elaine Sedenberg. I'm a PhD candidate here at UC Berkeley. So I'm here to talk to you. My motivation tonight is that I want everyone to understand, a lot of you have heard presentations about my past projects, which have kind of been in a range of subjects. And then I want to talk about how this leads up to my dissertation project and what I'm working on right now. Of course, that's all in progress and is a massive project. But I just kind of want everyone to be aware of what I'm working on, why I work on it, and also how I work on it. So a lot of this centers around responsible information sharing and gathering. Who's collecting the data, who are they sharing it with, and particularly around research, product development, where that line might get blurred, and also mystery or unknown uses. Because I think a lot of times in the tech that we saw, some of our previous examples have illustrated, okay, oh no. Well, surprise. This is now 2 days in a row. I've had a computer go down on a presentation, and I've had to like wing it without slides. It's fine. There we go. We're back. It's all good. It's all good. OK. So tonight, we're going to talk about first my research context, why I do what I do, and how I view the world, and kind of my motivations behind that. Then we're going to talk about my methodology and approaches, how I study the phenomena that I want to study. And then we're going to talk about information sharing projects of the past, kind of the things I've been working on in the years leading up to my dissertation, and how that kind of fits into the work I'm doing now. And then, of course, we have dissertation, which, since I'm deep in the middle of that, this emoji resonates pretty well with me, but also I love what I do, and so I decided to do the cat emoji with the heart face, heart eyes. So anyway, so in a rare moment, we get to talk about me tonight and everything that I'm doing, which I think is great because we spend so much time on these projects as PhD students that it really does become a part of who we are and what we do. But I think it's really important to think about like where I came from. So I used to be a biochemist. I used to work in small molecules with inorganic chemistry research, and that's how I spent my undergrad. And I was very interested in how we fund research, how we think about who's doing the research and how it's being used, and how we can transfer that technology from academia into industry. Then I went to DC. I worked in science and technology policy and did a lot of work there, thinking about how we apply how we solve different problems, which leads into, there's kind of two orientations, I think, for science and tech policy. I consider them to be very closely related. There's science for policy, so that means that's more evidence-based policy making. So this idea that a lot of the work that we do here at the iSchool, we're looking for evidence, we're providing data and insights into how we make decisions in the policy realm. But there's also policy for science. There's also this notion that that what we're doing, how policy will influence the work, what science gets done, what's acceptable, what's not, how much funding we're putting behind things, and who's going to be working on it. My dissertation work is squarely in between these two, right? So on one hand, I want to collect information and insight and give that back to policymakers so that they can make informed decisions and really understand what's happening on the ground. But it also flips the other way, right? I want to make sure that we're making policy that's able to incentivize responsible innovation and be able to incentivize making sure that we're thinking through these sites of research and how that might be changing, and different data changes with who owns the data. Is it always going to be US Census data that researchers are using, or is it going to be major corporation data that researchers might be after to conduct their research? We see that a lot with some of the presentations leading up to this one now. So ultimately, when I was in DC, I worked on a couple open data projects. And I was very interested in this idea that it wasn't just going to be funding that determined who was working on what, but it was access to data, or what data had already been curated in a way that was easily accessible to people and was primed up to ask these kind of key questions. I also wanted to think about how these exchanges took place. I began to get very interested in more of the human part of that, so not just data that's about, say, the Earth or other kind of abstract or more concrete things that might not have as many privacy and ethical concerns, but as soon as the data became about people, how we were going to mitigate those exchanges, which I think then really influenced my work here at the iSchool. So to me, I view the world, and again, I view science and tech policy as one and the same. There's Science, the Endless Frontier. It's Vannevar Bush, and kind of this idea that around 1945, after World War II, there was a group of people in Washington who were thinking about how are we going to fund science. We're not investing as heavily in military development of weapons. How are we going to think about how we're going to keep this spurring innovation moving? And we had created a national lab infrastructure at that point. And so there was this idea of, okay, so why don't we set up what is now called the National Science Foundation and set that up so we can give that out to people. There was a big debate on whether you were going to do fund by merit or fund by geolocation. So in other words, like split it up evenly across states. We obviously fund by merit now. And so I was very interested. So that was kind of set up and kind of put into motion. It's not that old as far as I think of like education policy, agriculture policy, military policy. A lot of that has been around for a very long time. Science and tech policy and how we fund research and how we manage that seems fairly recent. Similarly, with research ethics coming out of NIH Hospital, National Institutes of Health, that was the first time you had medical doctors and researchers co-located at one point, and the extramural grants, so grants that were given outside of the government, were growing for the first time. There was a lot of things that were happening at once. Sometimes then we'd find out about things like the Tuskegee experiments that happened retroactively. I think that didn't come out until the early 1970s. But there was a lot of talk then leading up through the 1960s on how we were going to think about research ethics because it was changing, right? It used to be that you would go to the doctor and they would do everything possible to give you the best care, and now suddenly we had a surplus of a lot of different medical instruments and medical technologies, and we were thinking about how we were going to administer that and how we were going to test things, especially how we were going to test things on normal people. And we got a lot of laws and policies that came out of that, which have heavily influenced how we do research across the US, and now that has come over into social science thinking, which that's a whole other talk that I could give and have given in the past about that migration between medical ethics and social science ethics. But that influenced how I think about things. So here we are today in 2017. We're our hair on fire. Not really. No, it's more like a dude with a MacBook and a succulent working on coding in Silicon Valley. So I'll pause and say I'm using the stock images from Unsplash, which are open and free for anybody to use. So I decided to have a little fun with my stock images, and some of them are a little tongue-in-cheek, so I hope that's enjoyable, especially post-break. So now we're in 2017, right? I don't need to tell anybody in this audience how much we use technology, how much the platforms dictate our lives, how much data is being collected about us, both in sensors, or on our online worlds and our offline worlds. And I'm very interested about these large repositories of data and how that's going to influence how we do research and who's doing research, and also some of the ethics behind that. So again, in stock image fun, so there's a lot of access challenges, right? There's privacy concerns, liability fears, lack of resources in terms of like who gets access to the data. So there might be people who want to give access to the data, say if it's held by somebody who like a private company that collected it, but there's a lot of uncertainty there in how we're going to grant access to that data. That even happens at the federal and state level, right? And so some of the projects I've worked on have also been in that world. But there's another thing going on besides just access to data, and that's these fuzzy boundaries between research and practice, right? So I think conversations that are pretty common here is, what's the difference between pure research and what we consider to be product development? I think there's been a shift recently, well, somewhat recently, it's been growing over time, right, in the people who is studying these data and what types of questions they're asking. And I think there's this shift that's going more, instead of just building a faster microprocessor or a better, smaller, sexier computer, we're thinking more about how we behave, what we do. Again, in the past presentations, we're thinking about these kind of behavioral patterns and how we view technology and all these privacy concerns that are coming out. And so I'm very interested in that, especially I think the pedigrees of the people who are working in industry are also changing, and some of them are increasingly, they might be graduates of our program. So how do I study this sort of thing? I think it's kind of, unlike some of my colleagues who come at it from more of a critical perspective, I use mixed methods, which is fairly common here at the iSchool, and I use an interpretive framework based on pragmatism. So I understand that when I go to a company and I ask them about their practices, it's going to be probably pretty biased by the fact that they work for that company and they're allowed to say certain things, and I accept that as part of what I do, right? At the end of the day, I'm just trying to understand what is happening, not necessarily, there's a lot of other lenses that come into play, and those are very important. But at the end of the day, remember, I want to get my work back to Washington, and say, how can we think about the system as a whole and the consequences of this, and how can we do it better? And think about, given our set of constraints here, how can we kind of reimagine the system and make it so that we can optimize the outcomes that are coming out of that. But I am also open to the fact that there are political contexts, especially recently, that influence how we use these platforms, and social and historical ones as well. It's also very problem-centered. At the end of the day, I really want this work to translate into something that we can try and influence the system. So and this is kind of then teeing up, there's a whole lot that is just like in progress right now for me. But I use survey methodology, so especially to understand users and how they feel, how they think about, there's a lot in the press about how people, there's a lot in the press about how companies might be manipulating different platforms or changing different things, and I think there's a growing awareness of this. I think also regular people, everyday citizens, have been a part of research all along, right? So they opt in, they donate blood, they do other things that are kind of like contributing to these larger systems, and I'm very interested in what people think about this. What trade-offs do they want? What are the risks that how they hold their data, how they don't, and there's certain examples of that. But so I'm very interested in that, and then I'm also very interested in, because I think that's an important part of this equation, and I'm also very interested in doing semi-structured interviews kind of with the practices and at an organizational level, understanding how these organizations do what they do, and then kind of coming back into a policy and legal analysis. What is even possible, right? Like there's going to be a lot of limits and constraints on, there were certain things that were opportunities in, say, when the government is funding research, but say if they're not, kind of how can we work on that? So I wanted to lead up, again, thinking through what I want everyone to get out of tonight is kind of generally what I'm working on right now, and also how my past work leads into this and has really influenced where I ended up with my dissertation work. So one of my projects, this actually came out of my preliminary exam, which is a 24-hour exam that the PhD students take. And so I did this work on robots and thinking through how interactive robots would be collecting data about users and how that data could be used for research and kind of based on existing technologies. This is going to be flyby, right? So I also did a lot of work thinking about the public health model of information sharing. So it's a voluntary contribution of a lot of different people sharing data with different governments or different levels of government, and thinking through how that's then used for research and how a lot of that's very sensitive data and how we've designed laws and policies around that collection and kind of applying that then to cybersecurity, which also leads into, there are no good stock images for cybersecurity, I'm just going to say that. So I just tried to find the weirdest one because I really just wanted no binary on here. And so thinking through, again, how cybersecurity practitioners share very sensitive information. Again, it has a lot of research context, it has a lot of practice context, and I was very interested in that line. Finally, I've done a lot of work with biosensing, so a lot of my dissertation work thinks through sensed data, and because I think that that's going to tell us a lot about who we are as people, our health, our behaviors, and I think it's already part of movements, so, you know, with quantified self, of people acting as a scientist with themselves and in small groups. And so I'm very curious how that could scale up and opportunities there, and also different things we might be worried about there. I've also done work with, and this is all with people, I'm going very quickly through all of this. So other work I've done with one of our former postdocs, Anna Lauren Hoffman, on informed consent and kind of the history here and how we think about how we created policy around this and how we had ethical values, how we implemented that, and what that might mean in digital contexts. And then now that leads us back up to, like, I always love making jokes about, like, dissertation. So I think here we are. This cat has absolutely nothing to do with my dissertation, but I really, again, like, I knew that this is a very quick presentation. And I think right now where I'm at is I'm talking to people, I'm figuring out where are opportunities. Yeah, I'm glad people find the stock images amusing. So I'm thinking through, I'm interviewing people, I'm thinking about user attitudes, and I'm thinking about what are the possibilities of what we know given all of these constraints. Because what I want is for us to be able to think through how can we optimize the opportunities with limited funding, with other kind of limited data access, where are areas that's worked really well, where areas it hasn't worked at all, and what can we learn and kind of trade between these systems. So with that, let's just head to questions. could be up here for 3 hours, and then usually your eyes would glaze over, but yes.
So I just think this is a fascinating set of issues you're grappling with. I mean, one of the hypotheses that I would love you to just comment on is that, we're at the end of the era of Vannevar Bush.
Right.
That, that was a very generous period. It was Cold War. It had a whole bunch of stuff associated with it. So number one, is that what you think is going on? And number two, the whole issue about ethics is becoming very complicated because, getting informed consent for my research, but now if we're reusing data, if there's open data that I have that I can reuse, who consents to what?
Yes, great questions. Okay, one is, in a very quick nutshell, I think we are at a point where we need to dramatically rethink how we fund research, both how we fund it and who's executing it. I think we need to rethink industry's role in research because I think that's changing by nature of the types of questions that is relevant to making a profit. Because it used to be that knowing how people behaved, yes, you needed to know how people might have used your computer, but it had, but understanding how I sleep at night and everything else is kind of different. So I want to understand that better because I think that sight might be shifting. And then in terms of the ethics, what I have found to be very interesting, I've spent a lot of time in historical documents, and I think there's a great book by Laura Stark on the history of IRBs, and it's just not what you think it is, right? You think it was this moment where we had this time where we thought, hey, let's not do bad things to people. It's this feel-good moment. It was awful. It was like there was a lot of skepticism. NIH Hospital really dragged their feet on wanting to implement anything they were telling outside researchers to do. There's a lot of, and then I think there's a lot there to unpack. And I think then in just terms of it comes down to liability, there's another book by Ruth Faden on the history of informed consent, and it's basically about, there's like the legal informed consent and the ethical informed consent, and almost always the legal consent, the legal conceptualization of consent wins out. Second, I think there's some interesting models, especially as we've gotten to data, where you're not injecting me with something, you're not even manipulating me, you're not even just talking to me. You are now so far extracted from me doing research that I think the types of harms are very different. And there's some interesting models like around genetics research with open consent. And I think where people said, you know what, I'm just going to post all my genetics data and I'm going to accept everything. And I think I was at Harvard, and they ended up pulling everything down because they finally said this is too risky to other people who are related to you. And even though they were trying to even rethink how they were going to do consent, it just didn't work, and we're still up against this barrier. So there is a lot here. All right, let's move on. Great.